This podcast is intended for entertainment and informational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the business psychos and does not reflect the viewpoints of their current or former employers or clients. Thank you.
It's the business cycles, and today we're gonna talk it out. The podcast about what execs shouldn't talk about. Connecting executives and those who aspire. We're here to have a conversation, yeah, we're gonna light the fire. It's the business cycles. Yeah. The business cycles.
Welcome to Business Psychos, where we discuss how to navigate the complexity, corporate culture, and modern life without becoming a psycho. I'm Mary.
And I'm Katie.
And we are the Business Psychos. Hey, Katie.
Hi, Mary.
How was your weekend?
I had a great weekend. It's beautiful weather right now in Boston, and this is my favorite time of the year. I love spring, especially in Back Bay. All sorts of beautiful stuff springing into bloom right now. This weekend, I went for a walk and had a podcast or two in my headphones.
You say that with as the view of someone who does not have a pollen allergy, because I'm dying.
My cat is sneezing up a storm, but I am absolutely allergy free right now. I don't know what I used to take like Zyrtec and like what's that stuff that you snort, the Flonase. So speaking of podcasts, I don't know if this is going to go too far into the topic of AI because I think both of us are very interested in it. I'm working on a research project around AI. I'll lead with my conclusion, which is the more you understand generative AI, the less you're afraid of it as a principle. But the fear that robots are new masters can be immediately overtaken with the understanding and the concern about the motivations and the implications of the tech hype cycle around AI right now and the potential economic impacts of the bubble bursting. I mean, I won't go into length here on this. There's a great podcast by Ed Zitron called Better Offline that does an awesome job.
I just want to call out a fellow podcaster because I'm a big fan of the Modern Wisdom podcast. It's Chris Williamson, who's hit 2 million subscribers recently. And I'm just a fan of people who are intellectually curious, a generous worldview or a worldview of knowledge and understanding can maybe help. I love his show, and I thought that was a pretty significant milestone. And he's been mentored under some other of the old big names of other podcasters out there. So now that we have our headsets on, I thought I would give him a call out. He's got a wide range of guests, and what I appreciate is that he encourages healthy discourse. I think we're in a culture right now where shows like his want to veer on, which team are you on? Mm-hmm. And what I appreciate is that he kind of goes away from that and just says, like, let's just do some research and understand it and have a conversation. And he has people on from, the spectrum of political bent. And so, yeah, I appreciate that. So,
once you're actually producing a podcast, the way that I look at people now who are really effectively and successfully building audiences and running podcasts, I was just thinking the other day that now I listen to the closing credits on podcasts because I want to hear about all the roles that they have in their production. So just quickly, one other podcast, and I'll get off the topic of other podcasts and we can get to ours. I listened to it this weekend while I was sitting in the Boston Common. And this actually relates to what we'll talk about today and how collaboration, self-awareness, self-regulation, and compromise matter in authenticity. The podcast is called The Price of Paradise, about a British woman who moves her entire family to an island of indigenous land in Nicaragua that she purchased from an American business owner, and how there's this theme throughout the podcast about the fact that like everyone else's needs and desires get ignored as she just kind of plows forward for her to live in her quote unquote truth. So podcast.
Love them. So on to ours. And speaking of buzzwords and things that are out there, vague and kind of misunderstood, is this term authenticity. So it's jumped from personal development into the professional world. These days, it's not surprising to see posts on LinkedIn entitled Authenticity at Work or Be Your True Self and Build a Compassionate Culture. When I was doing research, I saw one that said Embracing Authentic Leadership. I was like, okay. So on today's show, we're going to talk about authenticity next on Business Psychos. Authenticity today we're talking about in a business context. The simple definition for this is the quality of being real or genuine. Katie, you and I talk about these types of things a lot. You know, I believe that knowing oneself fully is a critical part of personal development, self-actualization, growth, all that good stuff. It underlies the basis of psychotherapy and even some spiritual practices. I fully agree that self-work or personal practice is important, and I feel that this is a critical component of professional development. That all said, in my mind, I don't feel that this all equates to people feeling that they should be their real self in the workplace. And I feel this way regardless if we're talking about someone working at a 200,000 person company or whether they're self-employed. I love stand-ups. I've mentioned that on a couple shows already. And I just happened to catch the recent Colin Quinn comedy show called Our Time Is Up. He has this great line in the show that goes, "Nobody mentions that your authentic self isn't your best self." He said, "We keep trying to achieve something that's not the best you." And it was funny. And of course, there's lots of other stuff around it. But it struck me because I knew we had this episode coming up. And I thought, well, yeah, we all have our shadow and the things which make us rough and also human. But not all of it's good, right? If you watch someone's behavior in traffic or when their flight's canceled, authentic, sure, but not always good behavior. And I'm there too. I've certainly experienced this. I think the fact that we can all be jerks sometimes is a point which is notably absent in most of the discussions around authenticity that I'm seeing, particularly at work, right? I think that in interpersonal, realm is somewhat different. I view it as like the point is to see your authentic self and where the improvements are necessary and then to focus on them. The destination isn't to stay a jerk. And I just want to underscore that if this is missing from the conversation, it's possible authenticity could be used as an excuse for not addressing aspects of ourselves that are still a work in progress. Maybe we don't fix all these things, but we're still required either by law, policy, or social contract to be accountable for our behavior. It's almost like, Katie, I almost have this reaction that I think authenticity at work to be sort of oxymoronic. Like we talk a lot about the game on this show and knowing what your role is in a business context. Employment is a contractual agreement. Companies may have expectations which are not aligned to who you feel you are. And so starting with something that's very generic and sort of not so controversial, you may feel uncomfortable wearing business attire. I actually have a number of my friends who have kids going out into the workforce or internships, and their kids are really frustrated by the dress code. They may not feel it represents who they really are. They want to wear t-shirts and jeans or whatever. They might even feel that in order to feel that they're being authentic, they always have to dress in a style that's consistent with who they feel they are. But in a work environment, the company takes precedence over authenticity. And that's sort of a simple, easy one. I feel that it can be risky to be authentic at work. Your company is not your family and your colleagues are not your friends. And it can feel tempting to express yourself without reserve or self-censure, where it may actually be in your better interest to protect yourself by keeping some of your personal self in your personal life. And I want to be really clear here because I can imagine someone can pick up on some extreme examples. I'm not suggesting that you feel ashamed of who you are or that it's okay to accept or collude with bad behavior in the workplace. So as another example that's ratcheted up a little bit higher from the dress code, let's take the example of sharing information about your family with your work colleagues. On one extreme, you can have an employee who doesn't feel comfortable sharing anything about their personal life. And I've had some people on my teams who have felt this way, actually. And on the other end of the spectrum, you may have someone who is so comfortable being open and honest, that they share all the personal details like divorce, healthcare issues, financial problems. My sense, Katie, is that most of us fall somewhere in between these extremes, that it might be worth employees considering whether sharing too much personal information could possibly negatively impact the reputation, whether that's fair or not. And last point would be that this is even more important for leaders. Yes, being genuine and honest and empathetic are all important, but leadership isn't friendship. And too much self-disclosure can weaken your credibility, undermine your efforts, and create political risks down the road. I would say carefully consider the balance between being genuine and accessible, but also recognize sometimes that sharing too much with others can actually create burdens on them that they may not want to deal with.
So many important points there. And I imagine that similar to our listeners, as you were talking, very evocative, a lot of ahas and like, yep, to what you're saying. Authenticity, although it's a buzzword, is not well understood. And it isn't about allowing every thought and emotion you have to be expressed. In fact, authenticity is about your larger values and being able to contextualize your feelings and beliefs in a larger picture that serves them. How I view my authenticity is that it's the active expression of my integrity. It involves the brokering between my self-expression and allowing others to do the same, which means there are concessions that ultimately need to be made, which can feel like self-censoring, hiding important parts of who we are, controlling our emotions, not causing harm through snap reactions. These can all feel like restrictions, but they're necessary as we broker self-expression as individuals, along with effectively functioning and connecting within relationships and groups of people. And a reason authenticity is more fun to talk about than do is that there are trade-offs. When we advocate for ourselves or offer contrary opinions to the status quo, there are people and institutions that will not like it. There's a reason you hold back, and it's related to safety. And there's no process of revealing our truth that doesn't involve the excavation of the concessions we were taught to make before we could consciously broker them. So allowing ourselves to express frustration, anger, the vulnerability of fear, big emotions that are painful or excruciatingly pleasurable is a first layer of accessing authenticity, especially if doing so has been suppressed, which it often is. I think this is what Colin Quinn may have been talking about, but this is not the final state of revelation. I often process my thoughts and feelings outside of work and relationships through my Parinama method practice. It's why I can provide clear thinking and leadership instead of focusing on how a situation serves or impacts me specifically. Lack of emotional regulation impacts our ability to lead. So to be effective with people, we need to meet them where they are, which involves adjusting our approach from one that prioritizes whatever is arising by way of our feelings and emotions to having the ability to expand our capacity and literacy with our thoughts and emotions. This is the kind of thing that becomes really clear, especially if you're responsible for the stewardship of a child's development. And being a boss ultimately is that you have to be capable of putting the needs of someone else before yours, is, especially when you're feeling highly charged by a situation. Part of this brokering is making the professional concessions for our larger values. So in the case of dress code, in office policy and work environment that are not aligned with our personal preferences, these can be concessions we make in the service of larger goals that align with our integrity. I think it was Oprah who said, do what you have to do until you can do what you want to do. If you are not clear about your larger values, making concessions with things like dress code and in-office policies they'll be overly wrought. If a work environment is not a fit, it isn't a fit. And rather than becoming bitter about it and becoming toxic for people who need to make it work, we want to focus on the path forward. And this is a level of executive functioning that really separates people relative to their seniority and professional maturity. So as far as authenticity and integrity at work are concerned, I don't think I was capable of playing the game effectively until I understood my underlying behavior patterns and could recognize patterns in others and regulate my emotions. Before I was capable of these things, I had a lot of emotions, which I rationalized with beliefs, the kind of stuff that can be easily mistaken as authentic, in air quotes, just because they're overwhelming and strong, but are actually just emotional dysregulation. And just as a side note, like I've negotiated or been clear about my dress code and other lifestyle considerations in the last 3 full-time roles and also with clients. And for the most part, I'm really clear about what they can expect from me. For example, I'll wear high-end athleisure when I'm not client-facing. I've set the expectation that I don't clock in until 9:30 because of my practice. I've set limits on the complexity of the advising I'm willing to do on a project, and I've required furnished housing to be provided within walking distance of the office. And whether this is relatable or not, on the other side of that, I have invested tremendous sums of money to have very expensive clothing to attend pitch meetings and be able to project level of success and composure for enterprise level clients. The idea of being authentic as far as, stepping into a boardroom and being like, look, I got to be me, and you're wearing a sweatsuit. It's like, sure, you can be you, but the fact of the matter is back to the accountability for what the outcome is. You have to realize you're going to pay with how seriously they're able and willing to take you.
And can we look for a picture of an athleisure outfit in the 8 box this week, Katie? For our listeners who haven't picked up on this brilliant marketing that Katie has put together, we dropped a bunch of clues about what's in each of our episodes. I'm just going to drop a little hint that there might be a little picture of a really trendy tracksuit in there this week.
So
I thought you were about to propose a line of Business Psycho's athleisure work clothing line.
Sponsored.
Is that next for us?
At least merch. You roll into work wearing anything that says Business Psychos on it, and you've certainly stepped into your authenticity in a major way. You're ready to see what the repercussions are for expressing yourself.
You're just walking around the hallway going, if you know, you know.
At this point in time, I would advise against wearing anything that said Business Psychos to your job. So, case for being authentic. So here I go. We have chances to learn how to better professionally align ourselves as our career progresses if we choose to take them. For example, I worked for a massive pharmaceutical company and found the focus on following orders over being effective to be infuriating, especially since my income was tied to it. I was in sales, and following a call list that didn't work in my territory drove me nuts. It meant more work for me, which is my pet peeve. Because in order to succeed, I had to follow the company call list and also make the calls that my analysis was showing would actually get me a result. Even after that led me to being number 1 in the country, I was still strongly instructed that I still had to follow the call list that they know didn't work. You can see me still getting steamed. After that, I went to smaller companies where I had more freedom. Then I moved to tech growth companies, which was a natural match for my drive and innovation. And every time I left a company, I would iterate. I'd create a list of around 3 qualities my next company had to have, having learned something about how to identify the best possible fit for myself from what I didn't like about my previous roles. Things like size and stage, certain qualities of the culture, what I needed for my development, qualities in my boss and leadership. As I learned more about myself through my professional experiences, I would get better at identifying alignment. And our authenticity and integrity are alive, and they're constantly revealing new facets as they shift in the changing context of life. I'll say it again. There is a trade-off that is not often discussed, that being true to yourself and speaking honestly from your perspective tends to be polarizing. And if you are not consciously aware of making this trade, it can feel unjust when people respond negatively to us expressing ourselves. Like, authenticity is alive. It means we need to adjust and move as we learn more about what's right for us. We also have to realize that we may not be everybody's cup of tea. As you express yourself, there is a push-pull where people who are aligned with you will feel closer to you, and others will go the opposite direction. If at some point during your professional development process, you come to realize your job is misaligned with your true self, take control and find a better fit situation, I would dissuade people from trying to make their new self, as they begin to, come into greater levels of authenticity, to make that new self fit into an old environment. And this relates back to our show on outgrowing people and places. Like, wisdom is knowing what you can and cannot change.
I love that. I'm hearing so much, which very consistent with how I experience you, Katie, is I'm hearing a lot about accountability. I think the other thing that struck me as you were speaking is what you just said, how you have clarity around what you can and can't control relative to your inside and outside world. That it's healthy and balanced to reason with yourself about the trade-offs. Like, that's where the maturity and the equanimity sit, and how you speak to it in the story you tell yourself about how you're experiencing the world, right? This is kind of like next level stuff, what we're all trying to do. And it also ultimately makes you a more reflective and reasonable person to work with, which I think kind of makes you more likable and more successful. So that was awesome. I think one of the things that occurs to me, which we didn't talk about, is, well, why are we talking about this? And sometimes we react to things that are out in the world, and you sort of wonder who's actually talking about this. I'm not actually sure how much of this is based in reality, kind of to the point you were making about AI, right? Everyone's talking about it, and it's just like, are we reacting to what everyone's talking about and everything that's in the media? And I think for me, because I'm such a big proponent of authenticity in my personal work, my self-work, that I'm having more of a stronger reaction to it when it's applied in a professional setting. And maybe that is very representative of how I operate in the world, which is I keep those things kind of separate. So there might be a bias for me here. And so while I believe we should ascribe to the idea that we're here to deeply know our true nature and create meaning for ourselves, because this is a business podcast, I'm going to shift perspectives, and I'm going to take maybe a slightly more cynical, possibly unpopular view, is that it almost feels as though it's become somewhat fashionable to use therapy technology and apply personal development ideas into all areas of our culture. And don't get me wrong, I think in many ways this is great. We've just destigmatized a lot of things, which is really helpful to address honestly and compassionately really difficult topics. But possibly sometimes we can maybe go a little bit too far. We take something that's good and we over-index on there. So my sense is that the last 10, 15 years, there's been a number of shifts, many of them positive, but in some cases increasingly more extreme, that have brought along with it new expectations or entitlements which weren't there before. Doesn't mean it's wrong. I'm just kind of introducing change, that there's a shift going on. Maybe some of these have started at home. There's been a number of books and research papers written about this. Certainly, there's been a lot written about cultural shifts occurring in schools and universities. And now, as these generations get older, we're starting to see these cultural shifts impact the workplace. My sense is that they're starting to address some of these cultural shifts, and you start to see them to show up in things like employee engagement programs. Going back to authenticity, the risk in my mind is that employees, possibly new employees who haven't gone through the ranks and learned and been mentored and all that, might potentially think that they should, or it's okay to act the same way as they do on, say, TikTok or at Thanksgiving dinner, when they're traveling, as they do in a conference room in a meeting. And irrespective of my personal feelings about any of these cultural shifts, I think it's beneficial for employees and companies when healthy boundaries are maintained between personal lives and work environments. And so I'm going to use mental health as an example, because I'm kind of rationing up my examples, starting with something really benign like dress code, and we're getting more and more provocative. So we did an episode on how mental health shows up at work a number of weeks ago. It was, I think, episode 2. And I want to underscore that I think mental health awareness and talking about mental health is a really good positive thing. And frankly, I'd love to see companies have better benefits packages for behavioral health. I think that's like a real area of opportunity. Instead of talking about it at work, like give your employees a benefit package where they can get the care they need. Many, if not most of the clients I see in my advisory work have programs on mental health awareness. They'll bring external speakers in, panel discussions, all that really good stuff. Especially if you think that even with just depression, 8% of Americans are suffering from depression. Let's use this as a case study or as sort of an example when we're talking about authenticity when disclosing a mental illness like depression. On one end of the extreme, you have an employee who doesn't want anyone to know anything about their diagnosis. Completely understandable. No one would argue with that. On the other extreme, you may have employees who really, really want to share and talk about this. They may even overshare information about their condition in the work environment. They may possibly reference it when they don't meet professional expectations. And here is where I think we get into this kind of gray zone where I would say employees need to be thoughtful, if not careful, about sharing too much information about themselves. Is it right or wrong that could be potentially held against them? That's not what this is about. If you have an amazing boss and you trust them and you want to tell them all this stuff, great, that's fine. I would just offer a word of caution, particularly for maybe younger employees, not in age, but in tenure. Disclosing this amount of personal information could potentially come back to bite you at some point in the future.
As you're talking, it's a cascade of, and I imagine that listeners are probably feeling the same way. It's so thought-provoking because it's actually sparking a lot of considerations as far as experiences in other companies. We have an episode coming up that I think will be in our second season that has to do with your relationship to your job. One of the things that has become unhealthy for people is not understanding what a professional role is. It's something that's been used to make employees have blurred lines, work harder and longer, have emotional ties to their work that are not healthy for them. A lot of this, we're family stuff. A lot of this, tell me everything about yourself. It's not in the service of an employee's longer term interest. And I consider myself to be an extremely, almost ridiculously empathetic leader. But I will also say, in the no spin zone here, I will say that if somebody discloses something to me, it will impact what I think their capability is. Very unpopular thing to say out loud, but I will say that it's like you really want to control what you're disclosing to your boss and understand that relationship is very different, is very different than what it seems. Because ultimately, if you are a leader, your fiduciary responsibility ultimately is to be making decisions that are in the best interest for the group. And having worked and advised in some pretty young companies, and by young I mean tech, and skewing with new to the workforce as being sort of predominantly represented. It happens a lot in tech. You have a younger workforce. Shout out to our ageism episode. But my experience has been in these companies that I've worked in recent years, there seems to be larger issues with employees, first of all, not being engaged in the work, but being highly engaged in the personalness of their connection to the job. Explain that one another time. Being entitled, and also with that entitlement, the creation of these pockets of toxic dissension, specifically, directing negativity to the company for, not doing enough for them in ways that to me have become like really outside what I think is a reasonable expectation for an employer. And just to backtrack me as a reference point, anyone who has ever worked for me would say like, God, I am probably on the outer limits in terms of being really interested in the deeper drives and getting a person to higher performance. So, with that being said, I think that is an area where I personally have overstepped what I consider to be some boundaries. That's something for me to think about. When I work with an individual or an organization, my first conversation is about longer term goals and objectives and finding what matters to the person or the organization. This way it's easier for me to steer the behavior in the direction of what serves the larger motivations and align with the organization's goals. I was once brought into a company where the CEO was sitting down with all of their reports and being like, what are your dreams? What is it that you want to be? People want to be on a winning team. So everybody doing their disparate dream work to build the skills for this career that they don't even really understand what it is. Let's be honest. It's just sort of a notion of something they picked up along the way. Everybody was so fractured in that organization. It was like an organization that literally couldn't get out of its own way because every single person was working in the direction of the thing that mattered to them individually. And I do think that entitlement is part of this discussion because we're talking about what it means to be part of the greater good of a group or organization, which means making concessions. At a recent company I worked with, I supported bringing speakers in, but ultimately there wasn't a sense that leadership was in fundamental alignment with the messages being given. And the dissonance between the speakers and the lived experience of the people working in the company actually did more harm than good. As far as being authentic, confident, larger than life personalities are usually considered, comfortable in their own skin and versus a more introspective, introverted salesperson, they might think they will come up short without those big, expansive qualities. But the truth is, sales is not about putting on a show. It's about persistence, observation, problem solving, consistent execution, effective communication. Some of the most elite sales professionals I've worked with were quiet, competitive, hardworking engineer types. And the important part of being authentic is being uniquely who you are and not hoping your strengths are the ones that are traditionally recognized. And in some cases, mistakenly being considered to be more desirable. With all things, there are nuance. And you spoke to this earlier, as our strengths will be naturally occurring. And then there are the qualities that don't come so naturally to us, where we either have to surround ourselves with people who can supply those deficiencies. I do that a lot. Or we have to put ourselves in the position where we're doing the extra work to do this stuff that doesn't come naturally, otherwise suffer the consequences. This is a topic that may come up when we discuss shame, the idea that you're supposed to be good at everything.
I love all of that. I think this has been my New Year's resolution for a couple of years, which is like be yourself and see what happens, or see who stays. I've also seen if you pretend to be who you aren't, your people can't find you. I really like that one. So yeah, we're all work in progress. The authentic, not perfect us. And to your point, making concessions and also understanding yourself probably more deeply and honestly than you do today. Knowing which situations to put yourself in that are going to bring out the best qualities in you and or provide you the nurturing and support for the areas you're still trying to grow in. That was awesome. So when we come back, we're going to talk about what people and companies should consider about authenticity in the workplace.
Talking about what employees should consider about authenticity at work. So Mary, I agree with what you said earlier. Spend time on yourself, get to know yourself. Choose a company that aligns to your moral and ethical compass. If something changes and causes an untenable misalignment, which it often does, especially if you work in tech. Things change really quickly and unexpectedly. Develop a plan to address it. It's worth recognizing that it is a normal part of adult society for us to have different aspects of ourselves for different areas of our life. We will act differently and have different levels of disclosure with our parent, to our sibling, to our spouse, to a coworker, to an employee. This is an area where I can be challenging. I'm an intense person. I can blast people away without realizing I'm doing it because my internal environment is calibrated to high voltage. So, my recommendation is for people to start by focusing on yourself, focus on being authentic with yourself. This can take a long time. Master this first, and then practice sharing this new awareness of yourself with your closest and safest personal relationships. Be protective of your authentic self. Mary, it reminds me of what we talked about in the show we did on outgrowing people and places. As you grow into your more authentic self, you need to be aware of the people who may not have the emotional capacity and emotional intelligence to see and accept you. And if they aren't authentic and don't know themselves, they may not be the right person to know you this deeply. Like, keep a healthy boundary between your authentic self and your closest intimate relationships and your casual friends, acquaintances, and professional colleagues.
That's awesome. I love how these different topics are tying together. It's just all these little puzzle pieces, and it is complicated and nuanced. It's not so straightforward as one would read on LinkedIn in a blog post.
Right.
We're all figuring this out at the same time, and we're talking about it, which is great. And of course, in companies, we're talking about it as well. And from the company's perspective, they're hearing everyone talk about it. They're experiencing different things in the workplace. Their employees have different questions, concerns. I think that this is just one example of those aforementioned cultural shifts where they're starting to collide with other profound changes in the workforce and in the labor market more broadly. And my view is that this is a top of the house issue. And I say that coming from larger environments, but sort of your senior leadership team needs to be engaged in this topic. It needs to be discussed as part of an organization's overall strategy and evaluated through data. This is an area where companies should look holistically at their culture, HR policies, procedures, your employee engagement programs. Ensure expectations are clear and consistent. You hinted at it earlier, Katie. Employees could become confused if their company is heralding the importance of authenticity while also having prescriptive in-office requirements, dress codes, behavioral guidelines. Employees are, and they will continue to be vocal about any contradictions. So organizations should be proactively ironing these things out, make sure there's no confusion before they could potentially become larger issues. One of the things, Katie, I've seen in both my advisory work and at organizations where I've seen large-scale change programs that have cultural or a lot of behavioral impacts is underestimating the difficulty. Any changes in this space, these initiatives, they should be run and sponsored at the operating committee level, your senior group, with participation across strategy, HR, risk, legal. And the programs themselves, they should be run by people with organizational change experience in particular. So related metrics like employee sentiment, adoption, sustainability, they should be tracked and managed at the top of the house with all your other key business metrics. I won't get too tactical. I love it. I love getting really tactical. So I'm gonna hold off. Sometimes there's so much pressure. People are responding on LinkedIn and, hey, we need to do something. Let's push some initiative out really quickly. You do not want to stumble out of the gate on this one. You want everyone to be on board. Not doing so can really undermine efforts. I really see this as very similar and potentially the next return to office controversy. I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned there. Every organization, every industry certainly went through their version of this issue. Employees were, and in many cases continue to be, strongly opposed to the revoking or scaling back of work from home policies. In some cases, those changes were not implemented very well. And some of that had to do with the pandemic. So the pandemic was a big surprise for us all, and then we had to react. And then there was this rush to return to normalcy. And in some cases, changes to in-office expectations occurred on the back of the return to office from the pandemic. There was obviously lots of very strong opinions, but where those changes were not implemented well, it only fueled the bitterness and discontent. And so you start to see in your metrics spikes in employee assistant program activity, accommodations requests, leave of absence, and certainly even regrettable attrition. But in addition to that, and this is another episode we're going to do in the future, there was a lot of quiet quitting behaviors and impacts to productivity and work quality. So this is something that companies should be thinking about and have ironed down. I think, Katie, that this is going to be another topic that's going to continue to unfold and evolve over time, and it will be interesting to see how.
Awesome. Well, Mary, I agree. I'm like soaking that in, because I think this conversation is having it this way, where we're being really candid about the reality of it without glossing it over, sugarcoating it. I can't wait to hear what our listeners think. Mary, thank you for another amazing conversation. So
thank you, Katie. I love talking to you. I always learn every time we have one of these conversations. You have a great perspective. I too am really excited to hear what our listeners think and where people are coming from, and maybe there's some nuances for different industries or different roles. I'm really curious to know more.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it, because if the listener's experience is anything like mine, we prepare for these episodes quite a bit. And while you are talking, Mary, there is like a whole new flood of like thoughts and insights and recollections that come through. So I would imagine for folks who are just coming into this, that it would be, particularly evocative. So we really want to hear from you. It means so much to us to know how people are responding. We just recorded our first episode, which was a listener suggested topic. So we also want to hear what you want us to be talking about. So that's it for today. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please like, subscribe, and share with other psychos you know. We'd also love to hear from you, so hit us up on our socials. You can find us on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook under @BusinessPsychosPod. Bye.
Tell us what you really think, Katie. Don't hold back. Come on, I feel like you're holding back on us. What do you think about this? Oh my God. You always keep your cards so close to your chest. Listeners, if we can only get Katie to open up, I think we're going to get there. Don't worry.